Welcome back to the deep dive.
Great to be here.
Today we're plunging headfirst into a period that, well, let's just say it's stirred up a lot of debate, the Trump administration.
Mm-hmm.
Our mission for this deep dive, it's really to try and cut through all that noise. We've gone through a specific stack of source material, and we want to pull out the most impactful bits of information for you, give you a kind of lightning fast shortcut to understanding the key humanitarian concerns that emerged and, their documented effects.
That's the plan.
Yeah.
And our sources for this one, they cast a pretty wide net.
Right.
We're talking immigration, the COVID-19 response, international policy, civil rights, housing, even the rule of law.
A lot to cover.
It is. And it's we underline our approach here. We're aiming to impartially convey the information in these documents.
Just what the sources say.
Exactly. No taking sides. We want you, the listener, to be able to draw your own well-informed conclusions from what we present.
Okay, let's unpack this. Maybe start with something that was often front and center, immigration and border policy.
Makes sense.
Our sources kick off with the Zero Tolerance Initiative. That was, April to June 2018 at the U.S.-Mexico border.
That's right.
This policy, it aimed to criminally prosecute all undocumented border crossers. And it had a pretty profound and immediate consequence, didn't it?
It absolutely did. The direct result, and the sources are really stark on this, was the separation of over 5,500 children from their parents or guardians.
5,500. Wow.
Yeah. And many were sent to completely separate detention facilities. What's really striking, looking at the sources, is just how much criticism this drew.
I can imagine.
There was a severe lack of tracking, apparently, which meant prolonged separations, immense difficulty. Sometimes it was impossible to reunite families.
Just heartbreaking.
And the language used by critics cited in the sources was blunt. Human rights groups, pediatricians, even the United Nations, they described it as state-sanctioned child abuse.
That's incredibly strong language.
It is. Eventually, federal courts stepped in, and an executive order in June 2018 officially put an end to the practice itself.
Okay. So the policy ended, but the impact lingered. Beyond the separations, though, the sources also dig into the detention conditions inside CBP facilities. What did those reports actually show?
Well, the picture painted by these reports, it's pretty consistent and, frankly, stark. Widespread overcrowding, really poor sanitation, and a critical lack of adequate medical care.
Not designed for long-term stays, I gather.
Not at all. And our sources specifically mentioned this image that got a lot of attention. Children sleeping on concrete floors without blankets.
Ah, the kids in cages, right.
That's where it came from, yeah. And the sources stressed this wasn't just, a few isolated incidents. Watchdog groups, the Office of Inspector General, they repeatedly documented these as systemic human rights violations.
Systemic.
Okay. The facilities just weren't equipped for the kind of sustained care needed, leading to these documented conditions.
And it wasn't just about initial detention, right? The sources then talk about the Migrant Protection Protocols, or MPP.
Remain in Mexico, yeah.
Right, remain in Mexico. That seemed like a fundamental shift for asylum seekers. What did it actually mean on the ground for them?
It basically required asylum seekers to wait in Mexico while their U.S. asylum claims were processed.
Instead of in the U.S.
Exactly. And this created, according to the sources, immense humanitarian exposure. We're talking thousands of people.
Exposed to what?
The sources detail numerous reports of murder, rape, kidnapping faced by these individuals while they were stuck waiting in really unsafe conditions just across the border, sometimes for months, even years.
A dangerous waiting game.
Extremely dangerous, based on these accounts.
So while those policies impacted people trying to enter, the sources also show a dramatic change for those already accepted as refugees, right? The reduction in refugee admissions.
Yeah, this is a really significant point in the sources.
Yeah.
It touches on America's historical role, perhaps.
How so?
Well, the numbers. The sources show the refugee cap was slashed dramatically. It went from 110,000 in the final year of the Obama administration, down to a record low of just 15,000 by fiscal year 2021.
15,000, that's a huge drop.
Huge. And beyond just the numbers, it signaled a real shift. The humanitarian impact, as presented in these sources, was profound. It effectively cut off crucial escape routes for victims of war, persecuted minorities, displaced people.
Shifting the burden elsewhere.
Exactly. Putting more pressure on other nations.
Okay, so the border was obviously a huge focus. But then another crisis hit, COVID-19. And our sources suggest this brought a whole new set of humanitarian challenges right into American communities.
Definitely. A different kind of crisis, but with deep humanitarian dimensions.
So let's start with healthcare access and disparities. What did the sources highlight there?
What's quite striking here is how the pandemic didn't affect everyone equally.
Mm.
The sources clearly indicate that low-income communities, Black, Latino, Native American communities, they bore a significantly heavier burden from COVID-19.
Higher rates of infection, death.
Yes, and the criticism, according to these sources, was that the administration's response didn't adequately address equity in healthcare delivery, even in vaccine distribution later on. Some argue it actually worsened existing disparities.
And what about specific vulnerable groups? The sources mention migrant and prison populations.
Right. That was another major area of concern documented. Widespread, uncontrolled outbreaks within detention centers and prisons.
Because of conditions.
Largely, yes. Advocacy groups cited in the sources consistently pointed to severe overcrowding, a lack of basic protections like masks, not enough testing, inadequate isolation measures, all contributing to rapid viral spread in those settings.
A recipe for disaster in a pandemic.
Pretty much, yeah.
And as the economy took a nosedive, evictions and economic hardship became a terrifying reality for millions. What do the sources say about the federal response there?
Well, linking this back, the sources point to delayed action on really crucial measures, things like eviction moratoriums, unemployment aid.
Things people desperately needed.
Exactly. And the delay meant millions faced housing insecurity, hunger, especially in those chaotic early months.
Why the delay?
The sources suggest a mix of factors. Congressional gridlock was part of it, but also inconsistent federal messaging seemed to play a role in slowing down relief efforts, which just prolonged the hardship.
Okay, let's broaden the lens now, look internationally. The sources talk about international humanitarian policies, specifically cuts to foreign aid. What kind of programs were hit, and what were the documented effects?
Right. So the administration proposed major cuts to humanitarian and development assistance, the kind that goes through USAI and the State Department.
Named channels for aid.
Pretty much. And the sources give specific examples where funding was either withheld or redirected. We're talking about food aid, maternal and child health programs, responses to crises in places like Yemen, Syria, sub-Saharan Africa.
So real-world impacts on vulnerable people.
Directly impacting people in desperate need, according to these documents.
And this extended to global health programs too, right? Not just general aid.
It did. And there's kind of a dual impact highlighted in the sources here. First, the withdrawal of U.S. funding from UNFPA, that's the UN Population Fund.
Which does what?
Supports reproductive health, family planning worldwide. So pulling funding curtailed that support globally.
Okay.
And then, on top of that, there's the threat, a very public threat to withdraw from the World Health Organization, the WHO.
Right in the middle of the pandemic.
Exactly, at its peak.
Yeah.
The administration cited mismanagement, alleged bias toward China. But the timing during a global health crisis was obviously highly controversial. Critics argued global cooperation was more vital than ever then.
Seems counterintuitive. And the international focus also touched on international refugees again.
Yes, beyond just the domestic gap we discussed. The sources indicate a clear, broader deprioritization of global refugee resettlement.
How so?
Well, this was compounded by the travel ban initially targeting 7 predominantly Muslim countries, later revised.
The so-called Muslim ban.
That's the term often used, yes. And critics cited in the sources really pushed back hard, accusing the policy of violating America's sort of moral and legal obligations to protect those fleeing persecution, closing doors, essentially.
Okay, let's bring the focus back home now. Civil rights and social justice concerns. This became a huge issue, particularly after George Floyd's murder in 2020. The sources discuss the administration's response to the protests and policing.
Yeah, the summer of 2020, the sources describe a response that was notably forceful.
Forceful how?
Well, threats to invoke the Insurrection Act, for one.
Which is rarely used.
Very rarely. It allows deploying the military for domestic enforcement. Then there was the actual deployment of federal agents to cities like Portland, often clashing with local officials' wishes.
Right, I remember that.
And perhaps the most visible moment documented in the sources was that controversial photo op outside St. John's Church.
After they cleared the protesters.
Exactly. After peaceful protesters were forcibly cleared from Lafayette Square using chemical irritants, that image stuck with a lot of people.
And the treatment of protesters and journalists during that period also drew scrutiny.
Absolutely. The sources detail widespread use of things like tear gas, rubber bullets, mass arrests against demonstrators.
Leading to legal challenges.
Yes. The ACLU and other civil rights groups filed numerous lawsuits, as the sources note, alleging civil rights violations stemming directly from those aggressive tactics.
Okay. And rounding out this section, the sources also document specific LGBTQ plus rights rollbacks. What kind of examples are given?
This touches on protections and equality. The sources provide several key examples. The reinstatement of the transgender military ban.
That was a big one.
It was. Also, the rescinding or weakening of health and education protections for transgender individuals. And on the international stage, a refusal documented in the sources to recognize LGBTQ plus rights in many diplomacy documents.
Signaling a clear policy shift.
That's how it was interpreted by critics cited in the materials, yes.
Okay, shifting focus slightly again. Let's look at domestic economic vulnerabilities. Housing, poverty, and displacement. Starting with public housing and homelessness.
Right. The sources here point to proposed budget cuts to HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development.
Which handles housing assistance.
Exactly. And alongside those proposed cuts, the sources describe what they call aggressive rhetoric towards homeless populations, particularly targeting cities like San Francisco and Los Angeles.
What was the criticism there?
Critics, according to the sources, argued the administration seemed to emphasize criminalization clearing camps, enforcement, rather than focusing on care and housing solutions, potentially making the problem worse, they argued.
Another area highlighted is the response to Puerto Rico and disaster relief after Hurricane Maria in 2017.
Yes, Hurricane Maria, a devastating storm.
And the federal response?
If you look at the sources, they detail a recovery for Puerto Rico that was really prolonged and difficult. And they attribute this, in large part, to an inadequate and delayed federal response.
Delayed aid.
Delayed and controversial. The handling of aid itself was criticized. Things like the infamous paper towel incident, allegations of mismanaged relief funds, all hindering recovery.
And the death toll.
That became another point of controversy. The sources note that the official death toll estimates, which eventually reached nearly 3,000, were publicly questioned by the administration at the time.
Adding insult to injury, some might say?
That was certainly the feeling expressed by many critics cited.
Okay, let's turn now towards the end here to concerns about human rights and rule of law. Starting with asylum law revisions, what was the practical impact of those changes mentioned in the sources?
Well, what's really interesting here, or perhaps concerning depending on your view, is the significant narrowing of who qualified for asylum.
How so?
For instance, claims based on gang violence or domestic violence historically, sometimes grounds for asylum were often denied under new interpretations. This effectively closed off a pathway for many people fleeing that kind of danger.
Making it harder to qualify.
Much harder. And the sources also highlight things like fast-track deportations, and in some cases, removing access to legal counsel for migrants, making it incredibly tough for individuals to even navigate the system.
The sources also mention controversy around the use of pardons.
Yes, this generated significant debate. Our sources describe highly controversial pardons granted to individuals who were either accused or convicted of war crimes and human rights abuses.
Can you give examples from the sources?
Sure. The sources cite specific cases like Eddie Gallagher, a Navy SEAL accused of war crimes in Iraq,
Okay.
and several Blackwater contractors involved in the Nassour Square massacre in Baghdad, where Iraqi civilians were killed. Pardoning them raised serious questions about accountability and the rule of law itself.
And finally, under this rule of law umbrella, the sources discuss whistleblower treatment.
Right. This touches on accountability within the government. The sources note instances of retaliation against federal employees who raised legal or ethical flags.
Like during the impeachment.
That's the most prominent example cited, yes. Individuals involved in the impeachment inquiry who came forward faced repercussions. Critics argue this kind of thing could have a chilling effect, discouraging people from speaking out about potential wrongdoing in the future.
So, beyond specific policies and actions, our sources also dedicate significant attention to controversial rhetoric and policy messaging, the language itself.
Yeah, this is crucial. It wasn't just what was done, but how it was talked about.
What kind of examples do the sources provide?
Well, the sources list numerous specific examples of language described as dehumanizing or inflammatory, used by the administration. Terms for immigrants like rapists, animals, invaders.
Very strong word.
Extremely. And for protesters and activists, labels like thugs, terrorists. The sources also mention the reported use of phrases like stolen countries to describe nations in Africa and elsewhere.
So what's the takeaway here? What was the documented impact of that kind of rhetoric, according to the sources?
Well, humanitarian organizations, as cited directly in our source material, noted that this rhetoric wasn't just words. It had a real documented impact. They stated, quote, undermined empathy, fueled xenophobia, and emboldened authoritarian behavior at home and abroad.
Undermined empathy, fueled xenophobia, emboldened authoritarianism. That's quite a charge.
It highlights the power of language, not just to describe reality, but according to these sources, to actually shape perceptions and potentially policy outcomes too.
Wow. Okay. This has been a really comprehensive deep dive. We've covered a huge amount of ground on the humanitarian concerns that emerged and evolved during the Trump administration years, based entirely on the source material we reviewed. From the complexities of immigration and border policy, the disparities laid bare by the pandemic, through to shifts in international aid, civil rights concerns here at home, and fundamental questions about the rule of law and rhetoric.
For a wide range.
Yeah, it really was. Our goal, as we said at the start, was just to give you a concise yet comprehensive overview, grounded only in the information provided to us, trying to cut through the noise and give you the core insights from these documents.
And maybe, as you, the listener, reflect on all this information, it's worth considering a final thought. How might the policies, the actions, the rhetoric documented in these sources, how might they continue to shape discussions around human rights and government responsibility, even years down the line?
That's a really important question.
Yeah, what does this information raise for you about that delicate balance governments try to strike between security, sovereignty, and fundamental humanitarian concerns? And how do those decisions ultimately ripple out through society? Something to think about.